Welcome to a very special series presented by GayTalkRadio.org and QueerPublicRadio.com. In this series, Gay Talk Radio and Queer Public Radio will feature the complete audiobook Invisible Hand, written by Larry K. Mason. Although this audiobook is a fictional account, it could be true. Mr. Mason has designed this concept of a completely new monetary system which would, by itself, catapult the world into a caring, loving environment that we have all dreamed of. To explain his concept, Mr. Mason wrote this book and provides it for free on the internet. Mr. Mason decided to write this book, Invisible Hand, to explain the new system he proposes, which has the ability to change our world as we now know it. With his permission, Gay Talk Radio and Queer Public Radio present this wonderful concept for your listening pleasure and serious consideration. For more information, you may visit Mr. Mason's website at nopom.info. That's NOPOMINFO. nopom.info. On with the show.
Invisible Hand, Chapter 24, The Others, in which we meet a patent attorney who is changing jobs. Look, I know there aren't patents anymore. I know there isn't work for a patent attorney. That's beside the point. I know patents and I know inventions. I can leverage that knowledge, but I need help. Martin was sweating without realizing it, and his voice roughened slightly with the undertones of his rising desperation. You have the web skills I don't have. You know how to set up websites, and I know the content they should have. Between us, we can get rich if you'll just work with me here. The 30-something woman behind the rearwood desk pushed her glasses back up her nose, then lowered her face to look at Martin over the tops of the lenses. Everybody thinks they can get rich with another website. I've been in this business for years. Sure, there's guys that got rich on a website, Google, eBay, but there's a score of them. But that don't mean that every guy with a bright idea is going to make a fortune. Please just listen for a minute. I really have a dynamite idea. It's bound to work. She rose to her feet, disengaging jean-clad legs from their position on the seat of her leather chair, and extended her hand for a goodbye and maybe I'll be lucky enough to never see you again handshake. I get 6 guys a day in here with the same song and dance. I heard it all before. I ain't got time to listen to you guys and do my work, okay? So please close the door on your way out. Martin was struggling to contain his anger, or perhaps to avoid bursting into tears. Okay, he said, mechanically shaking her limp hand, but you'll regret this. One day, not so long from now, you'll regret not working with me. I'll cry in my beer. Now leave. Martin turned toward the door with a scowl on his face. He was tempted to slam the door as he left, but restrained the impulse and stood just looking at the closed door for a few seconds. When he turned, he saw the secretary looking at him with a sympathetic expression on his face. Martin's face flushed briefly, then he said somewhat stiffly, She really will be sorry she wouldn't work with me. Oh, she's just tired and overworked. She said yes to too often in the past, and she's a little bitter about it now. But if you really are having trouble finding someone to help you, and your problem isn't too big, I do know someone you could try. He doesn't have her experience or contacts, but he should be able to help you get started at least. At this point, I'll try almost anyone. Let me give you his name, number, and email address. I would suggest calling after 4 this afternoon. Thanks. Later that same day, having walked back to his office downtown, Martin sprawled in his chair behind his desk. 3 months into the new money, and it looked like the building owner would probably ask him to leave soon because other prospective tenants would be asking for the office space. He no longer had clients. He no longer even had a secretary. After 12 years of working for him, she had left for another job. Of course, he couldn't blame her since she wasn't earning anything sitting around the office. Secretary. That reference he gave me. Where did I put it? It's after 4. Maybe he's in. Let's see. Jasper Morton. Poor guy, stuck with a name like Jasper. What kind of parents? Oh, well, I might as well get this over with. Martin picked up the phone and entered Jasper's number. A woman answered after a couple of rings. Could I speak to Jasper Morton, please? Who are you, and what has he done now? I just want to talk to him. I don't know anything about what he may have done. That boy is a real trial to me, but I'll get him if you like. Martin heard her yell, Jasper, some guy on the phone for you. Don't tie it up all day now. What have I gotten into now? I'm calling some kid. What kind of a cruel joke is this, anyway? Hello? Hello, my name is Martin Hall. I'm a patent attorney. I got your name and number as someone who could help me set up and run a web page. Can you tell me who it was that gave it to you? He's a secretary to a professional web developer in the Foster Building downtown. My Uncle Harvey, of course. How can I help you? First off, I want to know how old you are. I'm 13, almost. Does that mean you don't want to work with me after all? Kid, at this point, I would want your help if you were 6. Can you really set up a website for me? Certainly. I set up several of them for my friends. They're easy. What do you want me to accomplish with it? I want to make it a site that people can use to find inventions that will help them do whatever they do better. That sounds promising. How do you do it? I thought you were the expert in setting up websites. You tell me. No, Mr. Hall. I mean, how are you going to have them search for the inventions? If they already knew there was an invention that would do what they needed, they wouldn't need your website. They could just Google it. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. I was just going to have inventions listed. No, that's not good enough. Anyone can do that. Listen, I have friends that could help us with this. Is it okay if I bring them in? How old are they? Is age really that important to you, Martin? Does it matter how old they are if they can help? I guess you're right. I really don't care. Will you at least tell me how many there are? Only 3. The 4 of us have been just doing things together for a couple of years now. Just a second while I get them in on this call. What the hell have I got here? Martin was not into electronics himself, so he was quite impressed when a few seconds later he heard a light soprano voice say, Okay, we're here. What have you got for us, Jasper? I've got a man who wants to set up an inventions website. He's a patent attorney who's got an... A young girl's voice broke in, a fast, slightly disorienting mixture of preteen enthusiasm and cynical authority. Not anymore, he isn't, baby Einstein. That's just one more job that went to Dev Null at the transition. Jasper responded just as quickly, his voice shifting comfortably into a tone of long-standing intimacy and good-natured verbal sparring. Yeah, Professor Obvious, thanks for the G2. My point is that he has an idea I think we can work with. Swell, what's the idea? The rapid-fire exchange suddenly stopped, and Martin realized that they were all waiting for him. Well, I was thinking that there are millions of patents in the system. Can you skip the primer? Just give us the Cliff Notes version. So, Alice, ever consider actually allowing anyone else to speak, or are you still going for Vice President Logarix Anonymous? Fine, Jasper, my oral acuity shall be inversely proportional to my loquacity, but please be forthwith, Mr. Hall, I have things to do. Go on, Martin. I'd like to have the invention searchable in a way that makes it easy to associate inventions with whatever process or product one wants to improve. That way it would be easy to find things that might make products better that the developer would never have thought of otherwise. See, Alice, it's basically a good idea. Everybody has access to the list of patents, but I figure what he knows is what kind of information they have. He knows what people have had to put in their patents. I figure we can use that information to generate an algorithm that'll do what he wants. What do you think? The product should be useful. Nicky, didn't you do a paper on library science last year? Another youthful feminine voice, Martin noted, but softer and with less edge to it than Alice's. Yeah, Amy, but it won't help with this. This voice was clearly in the process of changing. Categorizing is going to be necessary, but they don't go beyond that. What we need is some way to relate things that might go together functionally. That's the crux we have to bear. Don't go Ursine on us here, Mouse. Why don't you guys think about it for a couple of days while I set up the basic website and come up with the right way to describe this thing so it'll be popular with the search engines? Okay, by me. Call me Wednesday about 4 and we'll see what we've got, okay? Suits me. Bye, guys. Bye. Bye. Can you come up with a list of the information people have to include in the patent? If at all possible, I need you to have it to me tomorrow. Martin let out an audible sigh, the sort of sigh Jasper had heard more than once from the adults in his world. Just make it Martin, Jasper. If we're working together, let's go by first names. Okay, Martin, so I'd really like this stuff tomorrow. You can send it by email attachment. You know how to do that? I think I can just about handle that. Thanks. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so send me the attachment so I can look it over. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. I'll talk to you later. The phone in Martin's hand was silent. Martin felt like he had been run over. What happened? It was like the kids just took his idea and made it their own. At first he was amused, like it was some kind of joke. Then he felt a little angry. After all, it was his idea. Then he felt resigned. Nobody else was willing to help him. Besides, it was obvious that they saw things about the idea that had never crossed his mind. Maybe he should play along. He certainly wasn't getting anywhere on his own. Finally, he just felt depressed. He booted his computer and found the web page that told what one must do to get a patent and forwarded it to Jasper's email address. Then he turned off the computer, put out the lights, and stood looking out of his office window at the afternoon shadows. Spring was just getting started, and the light green of the trees promised new growth. Usually Martin savored this time of year. His family loved to take long vacations each summer to some place they had never been. The last 2 years that had been impossible for one reason or another. Martin had hoped that this year would be different. He had known that the transition would mean changes for his work, but he hadn't expected the whole concept of patents to fall by the wayside. There were still patents in law, but nobody seemed to care. It didn't matter who used the inventions. The person who held the patent was getting paid. Everybody who helped to use the patent also got paid. Patent attorneys began to report that they weren't getting paid for defending patents in court. Judges weren't getting paid for conducting the trials. It appeared that restraining the use of productive ideas was not going to be considered a benefit. The inventors didn't seem to care since their income had increased markedly. It seemed that having the idea in the first place and making it available to others was felt to be rather important. But that meant that the patent lawyers really didn't have much to do. His lawyer friends in other specialties also were feeling the pinch. Corporate law was dead on its feet. Since money could no longer be awarded in a case, there was little incentive to sue. Then Martin got his idea. It all seemed so simple until he tried to get help with the parts he didn't know about. Then he discovered that he couldn't just offer somebody money and have them jump to do his bidding. He had to persuade them that what he was doing would be a major benefit. Well, he was having trouble doing that. It seemed obvious to him that putting ideas together was a good way to make better products. I mean, they said that as a culture got more elements, there were more ways to put them together, and thus the rate of inventing should get faster and faster as more and more things were available to be put together in new combinations. At first he'd been sure that this would make him rich. Now it just seemed a waste of time. Martin finally went home. He didn't even go to work the next day. He did get a phone call, however. A girl's soprano voice, seemingly quite upset, erupted from the phone. "This is Alice. Listen, Mr. Hall, I highly recommend that if you have any actual interest in this project you so graciously have dumped on our laps, you move your ass over to that computer and set your brain in gear. Now, move it!" Martin was dumbfounded. Okay, I'll work on it. See that you do. Goodbye." Goodbye." And Martin hung up. The phone call was not over, however. Alice said, "Too much?" "Yeah, you think?" Jasper's sarcasm was showing through. "You learned that in acting class? I mean, come on, move your ass. Who talks like that? Really classy, and your mom would kill you." "Well, he had to do something," Alice said, flustered. "I don't know how to order people around. I was just winging it, you know, extempore and all that. Geez, I hope I didn't hurt his feelings. Do you think I hurt his feelings? You said I needed to shock him a little." "Oh, man. Okay, maybe I should call him back and apologize." "No, what's done is done. Either it works and you got him out of his funk, or it didn't." "It's okay, Alice," Emmy said soothingly. "None of us have had any experience at psychotherapy." Poor Martin didn't know what to think or feel. It was like getting hit in the face by a bucket of cold water. Some 12-year-old girl was bossing him around like he was a little brother. His emotions went through another series of changes, ending with determination. He crossed the room to his daughter's study desk, booted her computer, and started thinking. How does one categorize inventions at a more fundamental level than the classes used by the patent office? He came up with several structures and rejected them all. Finally, he put together a rather long list of categories he had considered, gritted his teeth, and sent it off to Jasper. How had Alice found out about his first mailing? Probably Jasper sent it to her. I wonder why. His phone rang again. It was Jasper this time. "Hi, Mr. Martin? Hi, it's Jasper. Okay, this is a lot better, thanks, but it still needs some work. Kind of a lot. Maybe the others will want to have a go at it. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, I have a website set up and some sample questions that it should ask. We'll let the others see what we've done tomorrow, and that'll take some of the blame off you." "Jasper, why did Alice call me about the categories and not you?" "Because me and the others, we thought maybe you needed a fire lit under you. We could tell you were getting down about all this, but really, we think it's a good idea. It has potential, really. Emmy and the others, they said you were getting depressed. Well, Emmy said your voice reeked of depression, but she can be a bit hyperbolic that way. Anyway, we figured you needed a little electrotherapy to jolt you out of it. Alice seemed like a good choice. She's been in this acting troupe for a while, and they just finished Hamlet. So, anyway, we thought she'd be good at that kind of thing." There were several long seconds of silence, followed by, "Martin, are you there?" Yes, I'm here. What kind of classes are you in at school?" We're not in school. We homeschool. What are you studying? Whatever we want to. We don't really have a teacher. We pretty much learn whatever interests us. Homeschool? Yes, homeschool. Like school, but at home. Home, school. We study whatever we want, when we want, how we want. No teacher, because we teach ourselves. I mean, the adults, sure, they help. They can drive and such, and sometimes we have to go places where driving is useful, but we learn what we want, when we want, how we want. Trust me, it works. Don't the other kids pick on you, or think you're sort of nerdy? What other kids? That's the whole thing about homeschooling, Martin. It's just me and the others, and sure the others think I'm a nerd. It's sort of a compliment. But what about the other kids, the ones in real schools? What's a real school, Martin? Never mind, don't answer. The other kids, what about them? I'm not a science experiment, Martin. I mean, I have regular kids for friends, if that's what you're asking. I play soccer, you know, and okay, I get the picture. It just takes me a minute. I have to get adjusted. I'm afraid I'm old school. Okay, not a good joke. But sometimes I get the feeling that you and the others are just toying with me like I was the butt of some big practical joke. No, the idea is actually a good one. It's going to be fun to play with. I think we may even make some money off it, seriously. I guess I really don't have any choice but to trust you, do I? You don't have any reason not to trust me either. Go to my website. It has my life story there. See if I'm trustworthy. Check me out. I'll do that. What's the URL? I'll send it to you in an email. You know, Martin, I think maybe you don't know exactly how powerful the Internet is just quite. Do you know what you're dealing with? You really aren't taking very good care of yourself. What do you mean? I learned all about you in 20 minutes on my computer last night. I know what you paid for your house, I know what grades your kids are getting in school, and I know how you met and fell in love with your wife. You don't take care of yourself, Martin. If this were last year, I could have spent most of your money and you would never have known what happened. I don't believe you. Your mother's maiden name was Olson. Your dog's name is Fetch. You like green peppers on your pizza. Anything else you want to know? All right, stop. I believe you. Christ, kid, is there anything you can't do? Sure, lots of things. But I don't waste my time trying to do things I can't excel at. Lucky for you, that list is a short one and web design isn't on it. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I think it's probably a pretty good thing you ended up finding me. Well, me and the others. Or I think this idea of yours would have ended up in the circular file. Come on, Mom. Got to go now. Call me tomorrow, a little after 4. Bye. Martin sighed and put his head down on his desk. This isn't how it's supposed to be. I give the wise counsel to clients. I don't get taken care of by a 12-year-old boy and his chums. Meeting come to order. We have to be a little formal today because we have to get a lot done. I'll run the meetings if that's all right with you, Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, Martin? Sure. They were seated around a coffee table in Jasper's home. Martin would have said it was a den, except it had a desk set up with computer and attendant electronic components, some of which looked homemade. A coffee table in front of the couch was surrounded by cushions on the floor, which Alice and Mickey seemed to prefer, while Martin and Emmy occupied the couch. Jasper was seated in the office chair that had served the desk, but was now drawn up at one end of the table. Alice was thin, with dark hair, brown eyes, and a narrow face. Even lounging on her cushions, she seemed always active. Her foot jiggled as if her subconscious was doing some quick dance, and her hand was often going to her mouth to further erode her already short nails. Mickey was at least 5.5 feet tall, slender and beginning to show signs of needing to shave. His hands would often pat out some complicated pattern on whatever surface was available. Emmy was black, short, and radiated serenity. She was taking notes on her laptop computer, which didn't seem to conflict with simultaneously contributing to the conversation. Jasper was short, even for a 12-year-old. His gestures were quick and decisive. Okay, does anyone think they have a basic approach that will give us an algorithm for matching need to invention? Mickey? I think we're going to need a program that constructs itself by natural selection, he said, looking over Martin's shoulder. I don't think there's any way we can keep up with nor modify the code accurately enough to make it work otherwise. So I think we should be coming up with parameters to use to determine success and failure in the search modules. Any opposed? All right. Next, anybody got a general approach for what factors to consider in the success determination? Alice. Almost all inventions manipulate energy in some way. We could base the factors on the kind of energy, the kinds of transformation, and the conditions of the transformation. Alice's eyes seemed to be examining Martin's innermost thoughts as she spoke. Don't forget control of energy like in thermostats and the scale of the energy. Size matters, put in Emmy. Emmy, be recognized, please, Jasper said with just a hint of sharpness in his voice as he moved to the front edge of his chair. Recognized. Okay, sorry, I'll get with your pseudo-program. I'll play along. Prime Minister Rasper, permission to vocalize? Right, okay, we have what I consider a good basis for a first try. We just need the details. Mickey, you come up with energy forms and conversion types. Emmy, you take conditions of operation, like in air or water or some chemical bath, temperature, and so forth. Alice, you take energy storage and size or scaling factors. I'll take regulation and control. Now, we need to have the computer be able to look at an invention as revealed in a patent application and correctly identify all the factors you're responsible for. I need some ingenuity here, folks. If you need Mr. Hall for anything, I'm sure he'll be glad to help. Any other matters? Okay, formal over. Jasper, this is going to take a lot of programming grunt work, Alice said. Do you think we should consider bringing in some computer nerds for specific code? I know we could do all the programming ourselves, but I don't think we have the time right now. I mean, I've got that thing at Juilliard next month, and Mickey has his photography show to get through. I don't know, Alice. I think that's a political potato. How do you feel about it, Mr. Hall? Can we let others share some of the loot? Loot? What do you mean? The pay we'll get if this takes off like it should. Remember that the more people involved, the more people share the pay. Martin was still recovering from the meeting. He had expected it to take hours, and yet it had been over in minutes. The fact that he had been given no tasks and had said nothing was quite humbling, but that was what he was beginning to expect. He was also beginning to believe that the group had done some dumbing down for his benefit so he could understand what they were doing. He had noticed that whoever was talking, other than Mickey, would look at him whenever examples were given. It was frightening to consider what the meeting would have been like had he not been there. I don't mind sharing the wealth if it takes off. There should be plenty for everybody. They were all grinning at him. See, Alice, lawyers can be good even at sea level, Emmy said, and the group broke up laughing. Martin was puzzled. Am I missing something? You know, Mr. Hall, why put lawyers on a submarine? Because deep down they're not that bad? Oh, I heard that one, but it wasn't as polite. So Emmy's joke was that at sea level, I got it, Jasper. And thanks, Emmy, I guess. Martin was still a little emotionally tender, and even though he had been made the victim of lawyer jokes since he'd told his friends in college that he was going to go to law school, it hurt a little that the others had done it too. Just out of curiosity, Martin asked, What do you really need me for? I don't seem to have any tasks to speak of. Isn't it obvious, Martin? You're the adult. Look at us. We can't drive. Mickey sounds like a malfunctioning hydraulics. I have a zit the size of a third eye on my forehead. You see the benefits of having a post-pubescent humanoid on this project? Martin suddenly realized the project wasn't really his anymore. If I'm the front man, what are you, Jasper? Well, I guess I'm the coordinator. I see the world as a 4D puzzle with all the parts there to be put together. I look at the parts and see how they have to fit together, if I want the picture to come out this way or that way. All I have to do is move a few parts and they all bump and jiggle and come together. It's kind of like playing billiards, only the balls are in 3D space and they aren't round but lots of shapes. Oh, and the web design. I got into that when I was 5. I'm pretty good at it. It appeals to my artistic side. And you, Alice? I'm the emotional driver, Alice said around the edge of her thumb. You know how Emmy's sort of the empath around here? She can tell what people are feeling sometimes even before they know it themselves. Well, she feels emotions, but I can put emotions there. Well, she feels emotions, but I can put emotions there. Like when things go crazy and people don't know what they're talking about, but they still keep on talking and it gets everything in a mess. I try to keep them in line. I guess that's why I like music and the theater and such. When I perform, I'm making the audience feel what I want them to feel. People are really interesting, you know? I mean, not in a way that makes me want to know more of them, but they're interesting. I mean, it's all Plato's forms and whatnot. Everything is an imitation of something. So I figure, why not just do it? Just do the imitation thing. Plato was totally right. You read much Plato, Mr. Hall? Maybe his Republic? Not even the Greek, a translation? Not even, as I guess you'd say, peripherally, Martin shook his head wonderingly. Okay, well, it's the cave thing. All we see are the shadows on the cave wall. What we can't see are the things that are making the shadows, right? So that's what I'm interested in, the things making the shadows. Oh, and I can cook really good pasta. Martin was beginning to feel a headache coming on. Mickey? Okay, I'll play. I'm the logician. Mickey was looking at some kind of transformer figure and flipping it from one configuration to another. I break down problems into their component parts so the solution becomes obvious. That's how I got my nickname. People stopped calling me Michael and used Mickey instead because they said I kept having Mickey Mouse ideas. Jasper broke in. Mickey, it was your ears! And the others laughed. Yeah, you guys crack me up. Listen, Martin, everything's really easy if you break it down enough into its component parts. I think I'm the opposite of Alice. She thinks everything's incredibly complex. I think everything's incredibly simple. But that's cool. She's into philosophy. Me? I like biology and life processes, evolution of complexity, chaos theory, and whatnot. Oh, and sports. I'm sort of okay at basketball. I mean, I'm tall for my age and have big feet. No cracks, guys. So it should be a natural for me. And if you calculate things properly, anyone can make a basket. It's a matter of simple triangulation and then, of course, basic physics. You take the height of the basket. Now it was time for Martin to interrupt. His headache was full-blown. Emmy? I often think I'm the group's mother. I know I'm the smallest here, and I'm also the youngest, if only by 78 days, 6 or so hours. The others call me Mom sometimes, and that's mainly to annoy me because I'm so small, but I sort of try to keep things together. Mainly I'm into languages, which are all detail-oriented, all about picking up the pieces, but they're also about the bigger picture. I only have 5 or 6 right now. Languages, not pictures, Emmy chuckling at herself. Well, plus 2 ancient ones and a few programming languages, but no one counts those anymore. But I guess you could say that's my thing. Other than that, I'm sort of into animals, mainly horses. Horses have their own language. It's almost all body language, of course, but if the rider can learn that language and has the courage and will to dominate the horse, riding can be like the most wonderful conversation. It uses your whole body, and it's like music and dance and poetry and, I don't know, like team sports too, I guess, mixed all up together in one art form. Besides, they make the most wonderful patient pets, and when you're on the horse, you have this feeling of exulting power, you know? Martin didn't know, and he realized he'd never know. And he realized he really needed the sort of drink these kids were years from being able to enjoy legally. If you're the mother figure, perhaps I should audition for the father figure then, Emmy? Martin said with a grin. Actually, Mr. Hall, we have chosen you for an uncle figure, if you don't mind, Emmy said. Martin experienced a sudden lurch in his emotions. Emmy reached out and squeezed his arm. Jasper nodded. Mickey punched him on the other shoulder, and Alice grinned at him. He wasn't in Kansas anymore, Toto. He felt adopted. The smoothly functioning group before him seemed to have welcomed him. He also was convinced that they knew him much better than he knew them, and they accepted him despite that. His feelings of failure began to abate for the first time in months. His headache dissipated. He even felt brave enough to ask, "Why have you let me into the group? I have the impression that you're used to doing things just to 4 of you." They looked at each other, and after a moment of nods and shrugs, Emmy said, "Jasper felt that your idea should be pursued. He also knew that you really didn't understand what it entailed. He knew that to solve the problem, we would need a representative to the world of adults. So, since it was your idea, he decided to see if you could do that job. At first, Alice and I didn't think you could do it. She thought you were condescending and considered us children and wouldn't work with us anyway. I thought that you were so depressed that you'd be unable to work at anything. We suspected you were clinically depressed, but Jasper did some investigating and decided that your state of mind was probably situational, that if your situation changed, you would probably be just fine. But he said that we couldn't just do the job for you and hand you success, that you had to do your part to earn that success. That's when I suggested using Alice to jolt you and get your emotions to react to something other than your lack of a job. Alice is a very good actress, and we felt that by her stepping on your pride a little and shocking you with her language, because 12-year-old girls aren't supposed to talk that way, she could change your emotional state." "Well, she certainly did that," Martin said, laughing. "Today we found that you were treating us as equals and taking us seriously and not as somebody to pat on the head and dismiss. Jasper respects you, and Mickey thinks you made sense, so we decided you were an acceptable adult. We really are coming to like you, Mr. Hall, Martin." Martin's high lasted for days, but he was never able to explain to his wife why his mood changed so radically. She just wouldn't understand, and for a time she even thought Martin was having an affair, but it soon became obvious to her that Martin still found her very attractive, so she just came to accept his happiness as one of life's miracles. About 8 months later, we find the group, minus Martin, in Jasper's cockpit comparing notes. Problem graphed here. Over 90% solid improving matches for each serious attempt to find appropriate patents. That should be translating into improvements within 2 to 3 months, but where's the money? Alice, over 8,000 last month is trivial, Mouse. Should be an order of magnitude better. Jasper? In one sense it is, Mickey. Sure, we're getting plenty of money to buy what we want to buy. Emmy's rather happy with her new horse, for example, but I think in a larger sense it's a big problem for the payers and the economy. There was a pause. Mickey's head came up, and he actually looked at Jasper's face. Alice stopped writing in her book, and he got a startled expression. "Rescale," breathed Alice as Emmy gripped her arm. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Emmy asked Mickey. "Beyond the dreams of avarice," Mickey nodded, grinning. Then they all started talking at once in tensed, almost hushed voices. Epidemic, payer problem, how to know, reputation, online, everybody can. These words and phrases were murmured by various members of the group. "Usual jobs or special case, oh ghostly one?" Alice's dark brows rose. "Usual, I think," Jasper said. "Saturday morning, I suppose, so we don't interfere with Emmy's writing too much." "So, Mr. Hall, we'd like you to present this to the payers as something they should include in the accounting system." They were meeting at Jasper's once again in the usual formation with Jasper speaking. There had been quite a change in the computer equipment at the desk. All of it was new. Call it another invention if you like, but this time it's a social invention rather than a mechanical one. "What is it, Jasper?" Martin asked. "It's just a way to prevent people from trying to hog credit. You know, like when you do some work that had somebody else's help and you don't let the payers know that they helped, as if you had built a house and claimed to have cut down all the trees for the lumber yourself? Well, how can you prevent that? Reputation, Mr. Hall, Emmy said. Each person must have a public reputation, a reputation that anyone can view, sort of like an individual person's web page, but one that other people create. I still don't follow you, Emmy. Okay, let me give you an example. Let's say you were a patent attorney in the old days. Let's say that you have a really good patent application that a client wants your help with. This idea is worth millions. So what you do is prepare the application with flaws that will make it possible for someone else to get a patent for that idea that is sound and by which the other person can get most of those millions. Then you sell that idea to some other company. That would be immoral, of course. The original inventor would be the victim of your immoral behavior. But what could he do about it? You did create a patent for him, and that patent did allow him to have protection for an invention, but just not the invention he thought he was getting a patent for. So he can't sue you and expect to win, and he has no way to tell the world, and especially other inventors, what you did to him. So you can go right on doing the same kind of thing to other inventors. But what if every time someone wanted to do business with you, they could check a web page and read about your past? What if every prospective client could find out what you had done to that inventor? What would happen to your business? No one would trust you to act for them. What we propose to do is make it possible for anyone who feels cheated to tell the world about the person who cheated them. In short, to give everyone a web reputation. But Emmy, that's outrageous. Think of the scope for slander, for libel, for unfounded accusations. A person could have their reputation ruined for nothing at all. Be calm, Mr. Hall, Alice said. It's not what you think. Well, just what is it then? Mickey, you explain it, Emmy suggested. The problem, Mr. Hall, is that people will want to cheat to get more money. Mickey's voice was now on a bass register, so if Martin closed his eyes, he would have thought he was listening to someone much older. Some people will give in to that temptation. We need to make cheating so obvious that the temptation will be very small. The best way to find out about cheating is to have people who are cheated report the cheating. Cheating no one knows about doesn't worry anyone but God, so when cheating is reported, it needs to be investigated. Are you following this, Mr. Hall? Yes, Emmy, but I don't see how that'll prevent false accusations. The computer can do most of the checking on reports of cheating. When the cheating involves capital goods, tools and such, the computer follows what happens to them. It keeps records about that kind of thing. So denying the person who supplied your capital is rather easy to detect, and knowing who supplied those goods and so forth, right back to who mined the ore and who felled the timber, is also known. As he spoke, Mickey was interweaving a complex rhythm of finger taps while staring into space. Your education and training is also easy for the computer to follow, so knowledge of chemistry, for example, can reasonably be attributed to the classes in chemistry one has taken and to the books and journals one has been able to read. The computer also knows who taught the classes and who wrote the books and so forth. Which people are working with you is known to the computer, as we found out at the transition, so that couldn't be hidden or falsified either. It turns out, Alice put in, that our very own invention engine was one of the ways that people believed they could get away with not giving credit. They thought that no one would know that they found an improving invention from using our web page. So there were lots of inventors and producers who, for one reason or another, didn't give us credit for improving their products. That's costing us quite a lot of money. So you want the computer system to verify the accusations? Exactly, Mr. Hall. You see, if people expect the computer to know if their accusation is true or not, they'll be both unlikely to lie to get credit and unlikely to lie to hurt someone else. But that doesn't prevent more subtle lies, does it? The computer can only detect lies about things the computer has data about. True, Jasper put in, but there have always been and still are letters of recommendation and answers to the question, what do you think of Joe as a worker? We just want to make those things public so that people are more careful of what they say. If you give a negative review of someone, you have to take responsibility for that review. There's such a thing as libel, Martin said. Since the transition, quite a number of my friends have lost lucrative practices in prosecuting and defending libel suits. Without the threat of an action for libel, what's to keep people from putting all sorts of negative statements in there about people they don't like? Oh, we think we figured that out too, Mr. Hall, Emmy smiled. You see, you have to put your comment in one of the given categories. We mentioned the work reputation. There's also a housing reputation, a driving reputation, and a gun reputation, and so forth. There isn't any category that gives one the chance to just spew general insults about somebody. But couldn't somebody just put insults into any category, even if it didn't fit? The computer has quite a dictionary, Mr. Hall, Mickey said. It can tell if what you put in has nothing to do with the appropriate topic. But even so, you have to remember that the computer is also writing what gets put in the reputation. People provide it with their comments, but the computer translates that into standard forms, so it'll be easy to read, terse, and clear. If you managed to fit insulting statements into some category when they got translated into some standard forms that would be both germane to the category and make definite statements, those statements could be checked, in most cases by the computer. Thus, if the hothead affirmed that the computer translation was what happened, he would be responsible for that statement. If he was shown to have lied, that would become part of his own reputation, because lying is relevant to most of the reputations. It would be posted in many places. Thus, an attempt to slander could redound upon the slanderer as well as cost him in future earnings. Redound? What does that mean? Martin asked with a surprised look on his face. It means to bounce back upon, probably unexpectedly. In this case, what was expected to hurt someone else turns out to hurt oneself, Amy said quietly with a kindly smile. Oh, okay, I understand that. Do you understand how we make it difficult to lie on these reputations? Alice asked. I think so. First, most things people might put in them can be checked by the computer. Second, what you say has to fit into a category like job reputation or housing reputation or driving reputation. This means that the topics that one can address in each reputation are limited by that topic. Third, the computer will translate what you say into some stock answers which are well written rather than quoting you verbatim. Is that it? Yes, Mr. Hall, that's it. Does the person submitting an entry for the reputation have to type it in, or can they just talk to the computer? The computer should be able to handle your just talking, Mickey said. It'll show you what it's made of your statements and ask for confirmation. If you can't read, it'll talk them to you. This should make for easy access, even if a person is blind or has other handicaps. You say that just anyone can see these reputations? All I have to do is ask the computer for John Doe's job reputation and it gives it to me? Martin's skepticism was showing. Jasper could wait no longer and was at the front edge of his chair. Well, Mr. Hall, it could be that way, but we'd rather have each person own their own reputation so they can choose when and to whom to show it. There are things more important than reducing cheating. Cheating is somewhat self-correcting anyway by gossip, even if the computer doesn't help. We think it's far more important that people should be able to control what the computer reveals about themselves to others. The computer is able to get all sorts of information about everybody, and you probably noticed that we're able to find out a lot about people without their even knowing we're getting access to their personal information. Martin vividly remembered how shocked and almost naked he'd felt when Jasper revealed that he knew quite a few things that Martin had thought were private. The idea that anyone could have such information just for the asking was downright frightening. So, Jasper continued, we'd like these reputations to be available only upon the request of the owners. That's another reason why we categorized the reputations by type, so that one could release just the information that was relevant without divulging extraneous material. At the same time, if one is going to release some of one's reputation concerning some topic, like housing, say, one must release all of the information on that topic. One cannot release just the good stuff. Have you got a write-up on this plan for me to give to the payers? Sure. We even have an appointment for you at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. That should give you plenty of time to prepare a brief, right? Jasper said with a big grin and handed Martin 2 memory sticks. I can't read this much material in a month, Martin said, looking at the multi-gigabyte sticks with his eyebrows raised. All the material for you to read is only about 20 pages. The rest is some programs and descriptions of some algorithms that should make this work better. If you convince the payers at the meeting that this is a good idea, they'll give it to some folks working on their computers that can understand it. Just give it to them after your presentation. Won't the payers there be the ones who'll make it work? I'd be surprised. The computer nerds almost never get to set the policies. They just make them work. No, I expect the people you meet at first will have little understanding of what the computer does and even less of how it does it. Remember that most of them are old and retired, Alice said. Alice, don't say things like that to Mr. Hall, Emmy rebuked. Then she turned to Martin to apologize. But Martin was already laughing. Don't worry, Emmy. I don't take offense at being called ignorant due to being old, especially when the people saying it are only in their teens. I remember how ignorant my parents were when I was a teenager and how much they seemed to have learned somehow by the time I was 25. They grinned back at him, and Jasper said, Just sell it to the policy guys. We can always sell it to the computer geeks for ourselves. Our contact information is on both sticks. Oddly enough, Martin had little trouble convincing the payers of the usefulness of the proposed software. Naturally, the payers wanted to have their own people check out the details to be sure that it wasn't all pie in the sky. The payers had been very concerned about the same problem and were actively seeking solutions. The fact that a solution for this particular problem would also solve a host of problems for others in addition to the payers was but dimly perceived by any of that group. We're not sure about the others. Invisible Hand, Chapter 25, Down on the Farm, in which Neil visits a successful working farm and buys a car. Neil had decided that if he was going to live and work in the country, he was going to need a car. There was a used car lot in town, so of course Neil started there. His first error was to walk onto the lot. The prices were posted on the side windows of the cars. On the same sheet was the mileage driven, the approximate miles per gallon, and the names of previous owners. That looked almost normal to Neil. He was just getting into one of the cars when an older woman walked up and said, "Hold on there, what do you think you're doing?" Surprised, Neil bumped his head on the roof of the car, a second error, and somewhat angrily answered, "Looking over this car, what's it to you?" Third error. "Get your off this lot and stay off," was the abrupt reply. "No, I want to buy a car. I'll leave when I've finished my business here." Neil's head hurt like blazes, but need I say fourth error? The woman raised a whistle to her lips. Neil hadn't noticed that she carried the whistle, but we can forgive him for that error, and blew a blast of at least 5 seconds. Neil was impressed at her lung power, and his ears were impressed with the volume produced. The response was not long in coming. 2 men came hurrying out of the small office building on the lot, and another man shortly came running out of a cafe across the street. Almost before he knew what was happening, Neil found himself grabbed and hustled toward the street and the oncoming man from the cafe. He was just on the point of using his Special Forces self-defense training, which he had not practiced in years, another error in one sense but not in another, when he spotted a badge on the man approaching from the cafe. Figuring he was safe in the presence of the law, he called out, "Let me go or I'll flatten both of you." The officer immediately brought order by commanding, "Shut up and stand still if you know what's good for you." Neil figured that he was in for it, since he didn't think he could take on all 3 of them. He stopped struggling and stood erect, his eyes narrowed, trying to remember the quick self-hypnosis techniques he had been taught years ago. He figured he was in for a beating right there on the street. Somehow he had violated some local taboo. The woman had followed behind as Neil was hustled toward the street and began talking as soon as the officer had finished. "Come on the lot and started to get in a car without even looking for the owner. You'd think he owned the place, and when I called him on it, he got testy and told me he wouldn't leave. That's when I blew the whistle. I ain't taking that from no slacker out for a joyride. You arrest him, Charlie. I bet he's wanted somewhere. You just check him out. You might show him the city limits, too. We don't need his kind around here." "Calm down, Desiree. He ain't resisting now, so we can find out who he is in a minute." Turning to Neil, the officer said, "Who are you, mister? I seen you around town the last few days, but you ain't known to me." "I am Neil Campbell. I live over on Maple Street in one of Sam Witherspoon's places. I work out at the TDP plant," Neil responded. The policeman took a phone off his belt and looked at the screen for a few seconds. He punched a couple of buttons and looked some more. Then he punched a lot of buttons and waited for about 30 seconds. "Desiree, I think you done blew it on this one. He checks out 6 ways from Sunday. He's not wanted anywhere in the state, and he ain't wanted anywhere in the U.S. I even checked with Interpol. He has a clean record. He's been working for the government overseas for the last 17 years and just got back in the country last month. And if that ain't enough for you, he has over $80,000 in his account. He can afford to buy practically your whole stock of cars if he wants to." Well, before the officer finished, the 2 men had released Neil and backed up a step each. They began apologizing almost immediately. Desiree wasn't going to give up that easily. "What's the matter with you, mister? What are you doing coming on somebody else's property and messing with their stuff without so much as a by your leave? Don't you have any manners at all? Do you just walk into other people's houses and use their stuff? I could have shot you, you know that?" Neil tried to answer the questions, but Desiree wasn't giving him any pause and talked right over the few words he got out. Finally, Charlie said in a loud voice, "Desiree, give the man a chance to explain himself." Desiree opened her mouth to reply, but Neil quickly began to apologize. "Please excuse my boorish behavior. I'm new here, and I don't know how things should be done." That didn't appease Desiree in the least. "What kind of place are you from that you can just ignore property rights? They let you just get in their cars without permission and do whatever you want with them? These are my cars, and I take good care of them. Ain't nobody cleans up their cars better nor checks the engine and body integrity more careful than I do. I don't let nobody mess with them. I don't care how much money you got or what high-class job you had before you got here. You keep your hands off my property unless I give you permission to touch it. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am. You are right, ma'am. I was completely wrong to do what I did. I'll never do such a thing again to anybody. You've really taught me a lesson that my mama tried to teach me, but I guess I was just too ornery to learn. I'll always thank you in my prayers for helping me to learn this lesson before I offended someone who was not as forgiving as you and who really would have shot me." With a little effort, Neil found that he really did mean the sense of what he was saying. He really did feel badly about handling her property without even looking for the owner. That was the really big error he had made. Without that error, the others wouldn't have mattered, really. Appearing to have no money, he was wearing his work clothes, could have easily been cleared up. She wouldn't have startled him if he hadn't been getting into her car without permission. She wouldn't have spoken so sharply to him, thus helping provoke his rude answer, and so on. All his problems were a result of his disrespectful attitude toward her property. By the time he'd finished his apology, Desiree had calmed somewhat, and Neil had experienced a surprising realization. After some further humble pie eating on Neil's part, he was able to buy a car from Desiree. But the realization followed him during the rest of his day's work. As a child, he had been taught to respect other people's property. He wasn't to touch things when in other people's houses without their permission. He wasn't to go into others' yards to play with their toys there, no matter how interesting they were. He wasn't to touch other people without their permission. But he had always assumed it was okay to treat things that were public as if they were his own, almost. When he went to the park, he could play on the swings and the slide as if he owned them. Of course, he couldn't prevent others from doing the same, but he could use them without asking permission. When they went into a store, Neil could touch the things that were for sale, in most cases, and when he couldn't, they put the things behind glass or out of his reach. He had gotten so used to this situation that by adulthood, he didn't even think about what was public and what was private anymore. He just knew the difference, though he might not have been able to clearly say what the difference was. But what was the difference? That now appeared to be an important question to answer. Now he was an adult. He should understand the difference. What was it that made him think that the cars on the lot weren't owned by somebody? What made him think that it was okay to just get in somebody else's car? Yes, the cars were there to be seen. They were for sale. But that didn't make them public in the sense he was used to. The food he got from the grocery was also out in public in the sense that it was on display. But it was still owned. He had no right to assume, just because it was standard food and he didn't have to pay for it, that he could just pick it up and walk off with it. Somebody else still owned it. When he had selected clothes in the standard store, he had felt as if he could just take anything he wanted to take. Why? Just because he was not going to have to pay money to get the items? But that didn't make them public. What things were public? Before the transition, the government had owned the streets and parks and a host of other things. Somehow Neil had gained the impression that that was not the case any longer. One reason was because the government just about didn't exist anymore. What did it mean to say the government owned a street when there was nobody from the government or of the government that had anything to do with the street? The police drove or walked patrols on the streets, but they didn't repair the streets. They didn't accept responsibility for the street. In what sense did it belong to the police? Neil couldn't see any way the police owned the street. Did the street belong to all the people? What did that mean? Such a statement made a mockery of the whole concept of ownership. Did nobody own the street? That made just as much sense as everybody owning the street. So who owns the street? Okay, Neil thought, back to the basics. In the beginning, somebody had to build a street. But it takes more than just one person to build a street. First, you need the land, then you need the materials, then you need a lot of labor. And tools. It took a lot of tools. Did the guys who did the physical labor own the street? What about the people who contributed the materials? What about the engineers who drew up the plans and specifications? For that matter, even streets, perhaps especially streets, need maintenance. What about the people who patch the potholes and rebuild the street after someone digs a trench across it? For that matter, somebody had to give permission for the street to be built where it was. No, wait, government is about gone. Whoever that had been, there was a good chance nobody was expected to do that anymore. Okay, scratch the permission. But still, there were a lot of people who were involved in creating and maintaining a street. Would they all own the street? What about the people who lived on either side of the street? They were the closest to the street. Did the street, by existing next to their property, give them any rights over it? No, that didn't make any sense either. Okay, basics again. In the beginning, the land the street would be built on was part of the property of several people, so they owned the land the street was on in the beginning. Then they must have given the property to someone who represented the people who participated in the building of the street. And the builders must also have been given materials by still other people, and the civil engineers must have contributed their labor, and somebody contributed the tools. They all gave these things to the person in charge of the building project one way or another. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. If that one person owned all that stuff, then it only made sense that he also owned the street that resulted. All those materials and all that labor had been given to him, so together all those people who contributed had given him the street. He couldn't very well give back the labor or the materials that were part of the street. He could give the land with the street on it back, but by then the land was only useful as a street. So the street belonged to the person in charge of the building project. That was the only way it made sense. Is it still private property? Well, it pretty much has to be. What other kind of property is there in a society that seems to have no government? Who controls the street? What does it mean to control a street? Let's see. Joe Smith builds a street. Then he says that Sally Jones can't walk on that street. What's going to happen? Will the police enforce that order? I don't think so. If they did enforce it, that would probably reduce their pay. Will Joe stand on his street and try to keep Sally off it? I don't think so. Even if Joe did such a thing, would anybody contribute to his next building project? Probably not. They'd think he was crazy. So what if he wanted to close the street unless people gave him something? Hold the street for ransom, so to speak. Would the police enforce that? Nope, I can't see that happening either. Again, there'd be no pay for doing that. Almost anything that Joe wants to do with his street that keeps it from being used as a street won't get the cooperation of anyone else because they wouldn't get paid for doing so. There isn't much Joe can do with a street without the cooperation of other people. Just because Joe owns the street doesn't mean that anyone else has to help him do anything with that street, and it doesn't mean that anyone else is obligated to protect Joe's rights with respect to that street. So even though individuals own all the property that used to be public property, other people continue to use that property pretty much as they did before. The owner gets paid for the people using that formerly public property, so owners will want the property to be used and maintained. What's the difference between that public property and the same property now that it's private? Now Neil began to understand why there was a lack of potholes. The owners of the roads and the people who cooperated in the making of the roads were being paid for how much the roads benefit people. Therefore, they wanted to make a long-lasting, useful road which resists getting potholes. Anyone who wanted to make money from roads could maintain them, with the owner's consent, and thus get paid. Before the transition, the builder got paid the same whether the road got potholes or not. Then he got paid again if he was the contractor who repaired the potholes. So he would make more money if there were more potholes. The people who arranged for the road construction weren't paying with their own money, so they didn't care how much money it was costing. Low bid won the contract, so the builders would make the roads as cheaply as possible. It was almost bound to produce poor roads. Since the transition, some individual was responsible for and was rewarded for the proper construction and maintenance of every bit of that formerly public property. As a result, the public was much better served by that private property than they had been by the same property when it was public property. Curious. Somehow he would never have expected that. The result of Neil's experience was that he arrived at his host's farm with his mind filled with thoughts about property, ownership, and what had happened to the concepts. The farmer, whose name was Dusty Leclerc, was about 10 years older than Neil and had a wife and several children. The two sons still lived on the farm, though they had built their own houses for their young families. Naturally, Neil started asking questions. How much did the houses cost? Nothing. Why not? To start with, this is my land, so there's no need for anybody to get paid for our using it. Second, the houses were going to be used by families, so the materials contributed would be earning pay as necessities for the contributors. Third, I persuaded the builders to come to help us with the parts that we were reluctant to do, like the plumbing and electrical work. They could have demanded that we pay for their work, but since we did most of the work ourselves and fed the guys who helped us pretty well, there was no question of that. So I own the houses, and if they're better than standard, no one cares. Anyway, the boys will fill them up with kids before long. I already got one grandchild on the way, but don't say anything because I'm not supposed to know. So you built a luxury and gave it to someone else and no money changed hands? What's wrong with that? What's mine I can give to whomever I want. Well, yes, but doesn't that bypass the payers? Of course it does. What do I care? They aren't gatekeepers for who gets luxuries. They have no power to prevent anybody from getting luxuries. They just have the power to offer luxuries to people who provide benefit. They pretty much keep their noses out of my life, except when I take something to market or bring in some hands to help out. Speaking of taking things to market, how have things changed for the farmers since the transition? Ha! Things are a lot better. This farm's been in my family for over 100 years, but there were a lot of times when we almost lost it. We pretty much survived by borrowing as much as we could and raising all the cash crops we could. There were times when only a soft-hearted banker trusting us for one more year came between us and having to auction off the farm to pay our creditors. This is the way it worked. We had to borrow to get enough money to put in a crop. If the weather was good and the market was good for our crop, then we'd make enough money to buy some equipment. If the weather was bad or the market was bad, then we got deeper in debt to the bank. Government programs came along after World War II, and we sometimes made money by not growing things, but we had all these restrictions on what we could grow and how much of that. Lots of farmers just couldn't make it. Most of the government farm support money went to businesses rather than farmers. One more case of the rich getting richer. Today, I don't have to worry about losing the farm. There aren't any taxes, and we don't have to grow anything if we don't want to. The worst we can do is not get paid at all. We have no creditors. We have no government regulations. We can grow as much as we want of whatever we can make grow. One of the best things is that we can improve the soil. We don't have to grow cash crops every year. I have several fields that haven't felt a plow in 4 or 5 years. I have several kinds of plants growing on those fields, all of which are helping to build the fertility of that soil. Also, since it lowers our pay if we use a lot of fertilizer or insecticides, we've come up with all sorts of ways to kill the bugs with other bugs and bug-resistant plants. We have a new kind of grass, for example, that puts nitrogen into the soil, covers and holds the soil to prevent erosion, and its roots go only a couple of inches deep so the crops growing on that same land don't compete with the grass for nutrients. The grass is also drought-resistant and tends to hold water in the soil. Bare dirt gets dry a lot faster than dirt covered with that grass. Of course, with the grass, it takes different techniques for planting and different equipment. They're coming up with a new plant stalk that can have several different crops on top. They could grow corn and tomatoes and peaches, for example, on the same stalk coming out of the ground. Since the stalk is permanent and we can have crops on that stalk that become ripe at different times of the year, we can have 3 or 4 crops without ever replanting or having to disturb the dirt at all. Neil could see the eagerness and enthusiasm that Dusty evidenced came from the real pleasure in his present life. The photographs on the mantel showed a man with a lot more tension and worry on his mind than the Dusty Neil saw before him. Clearly, Dusty would hate to go back to the old ways. It was also clear that Dusty didn't feel like he was being controlled by anybody or anything. Neil had to admit that the farm certainly looked prosperous. Everything looked clean and in good repair. Dusty's wife also looked healthy and happy. Neil began to feel like he had stepped into a Norman Rockwell painting. Dusty told his TV to call the boys and tell them lunch was ready, so Neil stopped asking questions for a while. When the boys got there with their wives, one each, there was much shaking of hands and introductions. The food was delicious. Dusty was proud to say that everything but the spices came from his farm. It was all fresh, the meat, the vegetables, even the fruit. Neil asked about the fruit, and one of the sons, who had seemed shy earlier, was unable to wait for his father's answer. "We started building our own greenhouses. We can grow crops now year-round. Since we can provide all sorts of crops out of season, we can get top prices. We're even providing fresh vegetables to some of the top restaurants in D.C. I think—" "Yes, yes, we know what you think. You'll have the whole farm under glass before we know it," Dusty said kindly. Then turning to Neil, he continued, "Red here put up the first greenhouses 3 years ago. We told him he was wasting his time, but he talked the lumberyard and Aldi into giving him the glass. I think it was the pies your mother cooked that actually persuaded them," Dusty said, looking at Red. "Then he spent a whole year getting everything ready. He put in heaters and some contraption that would wash the roof windows. He got seed and made some special soil for the plants, and the next year he was growing tropical plants in there and placing his crops in luxury food sections at stores. The next year he had those restaurants taking his stuff, and this year he has requests from places 500 miles from here. He's making 5 times more per acre than Dan and I are. I'm right proud of the boy." Red's wife glowed with pleasure. Dusty didn't know it, but she'd been the driving force behind Red's enterprising ways, and it had been her idea to build the greenhouses. "Don't you feel funny giving your crops away without knowing how much you're going to get paid for them?" It had always seemed strange to Neil that farmers would give away all that food without some way to know what they'd be paid for it. "Well, let me tell you," Dusty said with a laugh, "I was pretty leery of the whole idea in the beginning, but Mother here had a garden back then that happened to have a pretty good crop of several vegetables. You know, carrots, peas, beans, and lots of tomatoes. Well, she used to sell some of it to the grocery store in town before the transition, and she just went ahead and took food in there like she always did. Well, it wasn't but about 3 weeks later, and she noticed that she had some more money in her account. So the next time she took in even more things. Before you know it, she was making a right good income from that garden. So I took a chance and took my crops to the same elevator I usually did. They accepted my crops. Took several weeks to get it all taken in. Sure enough, in a month I had a little increase in the account, and in 6 months I'd made more money than I usually got in profit in a year. Now it takes less dollars in income, but there were no taxes to take out, and I didn't have to spend anything on the next year's seed or fertilizer or gas or electricity, so I figured I came out pretty much ahead. Now that Red and Ted are working with me, we make about 3 times as much a year as we ever did before during the best years." "But you don't get to know what you'll be paid before you agree to give up the crops. How can you go in blind like that? It seems like they take your produce and then come back later and just give you what they feel like giving you. They could be ripping you off." "You know, Neil, I thought that very thing myself. How could I trust that somebody would notice what I was doing, and even if they noticed, would they pay me? But I knew the elevator operator was going to want my crops next year, so he wanted me to get the credit. Also, If they didn't pay me this year, I sure wasn't going to take anything in next year. I figured that I could survive a lot longer on this farm than those payers could in the city. Also, I talked to a lot of my neighbors, and we agreed that since our crops were all going to the same pile at the elevator, we'd better be getting pretty much the same pay per bushel or we'd know that something was wrong. When the pay started coming in, we compared notes, and sure enough, you could tell pretty easily that we were being paid on the same basis. It did vary some depending on when we got our produce to the elevator, but that's always been the case. Some farmers like to shop around with the different elevators. I trust old Dave and Aldi. He's played fair with me before the transition, and he seems to be playing fair with me now. Now that I think of it, though, the main thing is that I can afford to wait. That is, I don't have to have my money right away. I'm not paying any interest to anybody. We don't have to have money for things like insurance or clothes. We don't have any bills coming in. You could say I'm being paid all the time, just not in money. I don't worry about the bill when I go to the dentist or the doctor. For what I do here on the farm, the free clothes do just fine. I get gas and seed and feed and fertilizer without having to pay for it. So I think I'm getting paid for my crops all year round. It's just that the money part of my pay doesn't come in until somebody eats the food I grow. Why does the feed and the seed store give you seed? Why do you get farm equipment free? Why should all those people just give you what you need to farm? Neil couldn't understand such generosity. How much pay will the seed store folks get for having seed sit in their warehouse and rot? What farmer is going to give them more seed if they waste what they have? If they don't give seed to us farmers, why should they be paid at all? Same thing holds for the farm equipment. It isn't earning money for the folks that built it, nor for the guy who transported it here from the factory, nor for Jesse at his tractor lot if that gear just sits on the lot and rusts. It's only earning money if people use it for farming. Nowadays, Jesse is always calling up to see what I need and when I expect to need it. He tells the factory what he thinks he can profitably place, and that's what they ship him. We bring in the crops, and that gets people paid right back down the line. The factory knows how much to make and when to deliver it, and we farmers always have what we need. Also, whenever I don't need some equipment anymore or it gets old, I take it back to Jesse and he does something with it. I get paid for lots of that stuff, too. Of course, at first, some of the gear I gave him was processed for scrap, but I got low pay even for that, and it got that junk off my land. Oh, and gas. Your TDP plant didn't exist back at the transition, but the gas stations still gave us gas for farm work because they wanted to eat, and we were a pretty high priority. Farming isn't me against the world anymore. It's all of us together. When I take a crop to the elevator, I don't worry about my price because I know they'll give me as much money as possible for it because that's how they get as much money as possible for themselves. Jesse knows I'll get him as much money as possible because that gets me as much money as possible. When neighbors need some equipment, I loan it to them if I'm not using it because that gets all of us more money. Neil said, if you think of it that way, maybe it's not so bad. Bad? Boy, we farmers never had it so good. Anybody that's willing to do the work can make it in farming these days. Everybody wants to help you, and none of them have their hands out. Neil grinned and said, you're just saying that because you want to keep these two fine boys close to home. On the way home, Neil had more time to think. He still wasn't being told what to do on the job, and Dusty wasn't taking orders from anybody. So far, he hadn't found any restrictions on his actions except those of ordinary courtesy. Keep your hands off other people's stuff, and they'll leave you alone. Neil had almost forgotten about the computer since he'd used it daily as a tool when driving Bart, and he'd even become accustomed to having Jeeves around the house. Was he being lulled into a false sense of security? Invisible Hand, Chapter 26, Changing Jobs, in which we find Neil headed west, seeking truth. Neil arrived home late that Sunday afternoon, feeling pretty good. He was digesting an excellent meal. He had enjoyed the friendly company of happy people. He was happy with going to work tomorrow and taking it easy for the rest of the day today. As he entered the house, he glanced at the TV and thought about what he wanted to watch tonight. He enjoyed TV more now than he had before he went overseas. There was a lack of commercials, and the shows were no longer filled with nothing but explicit sex and gratuitous violence. He never had to start watching a show in the middle, since the shows could all be watched at any time. True, there was a lot of experimental theater and other shows that held no interest for Neil, but he only had a few hours a week in which he watched, and there were always many things available that he did want to watch. So he settled down on the couch and decided he would catch the live broadcast of the baseball game. The Nationals were at home playing against Boston, and he decided to pick the game up in the middle live rather than starting it from the beginning. The stands were pretty well filled. This surprised Neil, since he couldn't remember such interest in the Nationals this early in the season in the past. It was good baseball. Neil began thinking about the ratings for the games. This led him to remember that the computer in the TV that was showing him the game was probably reporting his activity to the network. That reminded him that the computer might even be able to see where he was looking on the screen to report that as well. Neil became self-conscious. Someone could be watching him right now via the TV, even if he turned it off. The warm glow which had surrounded him since lunch with Dusty quickly dissipated. Its replacement was a colder than usual reality. His interest in the game waned, and he turned it off. He just sat staring at the blank screen of the TV, thinking. This computer network was simply too good a tool to control and manipulate people for it not to be used by someone. Those people at the baseball game were just like the crowds at the Roman circuses. A ration of bread each day and the circus in the afternoon to keep their minds off their situation would keep the people quiet and in line. The parallels to ancient Rome were terrifying. Why didn't they show the iron fist in the velvet glove? Why did everything feel so free when the power for absolute control was right there on the wall? There had to be an explanation. There had to be a reason for the lack of apparent force. Perhaps they weren't quite ready yet. Perhaps everything wasn't in place. Perhaps they were waiting for something to be completed. Perhaps there was a missing element. What could it be that was lacking? Were they secretly training police or troops? Worse, were they secretly training secret police? Still worse than that, were they brainwashing the children somehow to passively take orders? But he was visiting his own grandchildren once or twice a week, and they didn't seem brainwashed or addicted to the TV. His daughter said that most children were now being homeschooled, so that didn't seem like it could be brainwashing either. If the TV wasn't doing it, and over half the children were being taught by a parent, how could they be brainwashed? No, that didn't fit. Training police. Why would they need to train police? They could force control of the mob just by cutting off the food supply. Same was true for soldiers. There had to be something, though. Maybe it had to do with the computers. The TVs seemed to be everywhere, so it couldn't be a lack of TVs, but there could be software issues. When he was studying computers 20 years ago, Neil learned that the hardware was usually quite a bit ahead of the software. There were far more problems in using computers caused by software bugs than by bad hardware. Hardware was almost always easier to test than software, for example. Perhaps they were having problems in debugging their software. Perhaps hackers were disrupting things. Could the freedom of the USA be dependent on the activities of a handful of computer hackers? It didn't seem likely to Neil. Surely the security of such an important aspect of the controlling network would be one of the first and most important priorities to the ruling group. Anyway, if the hackers did exist and were preventing what Neil was rapidly beginning to consider Judgment Day, he had no hope of finding them, and his computer skills were far too old to be useful to them. However, even if what they were waiting for had nothing to do with the computer system that connected to the TVs and provided account information, the controlling group had to have some means of controlling those computers, and that meant that they had to have a close connection with the computers. So if Neil wanted to find this cabal, or whatever it was, he was going to have to develop a close connection with the computer system himself. That meant he needed to change jobs. Did he dare go back to Enid Lee? Would that look suspicious? Could he come up with a cover story that would fool her and whoever else was watching? She'd said that all she'd done to get the list of jobs in the area was to ask her computer. Of course, it probably was programmed to search for jobs for her, but Neil figured it couldn't be that hard since he'd been finding information on computers all his life. He thought he'd tried doing without her to at least find some computer-related jobs. But it had been 20 years since he had last seriously worked with computers. He could hardly claim to be a programmer or a software engineer. Perhaps he could get something that involved the hardware or of the database servers. There had to be a huge amount of information in databases to keep track of the whole economy. Just the identifying information for every person the computers knew about would take terabytes of information. Jeeves? The TV came on, and from it a sound like a babbling brook. You rang, sir? Jeeves had trickled in. Jeeves, I'd like to know if there are any jobs helping take care of the hardware that stores large databases of information. I'm sure there are, sir. Could you get me a list of any vacancies for such jobs? Yes, sir, right away, sir. Did you want all of them, or just positions in commuting distance from Aldi? How many are there in the whole nation? Since your question about taking care of was rather imprecise, I can't give you a precise answer, sir. But if you meant personally touching the devices, I believe there are 122 such openings announced for the nation. If you expand it to include those who work in the building, then there are over 3,000 nationally, sir. Where are they least likely to have many applicants for work in that second category? I believe, sir, that it would be most difficult at the Los Alamos site in New Mexico. Isn't that where they built the atomic bombs? I believe that was a city in which many atomic bombs were designed. Yes, sir. Is it still a government military base? No, sir. They closed it down as a military base shortly after the transition, I believe, sir. But they had a large-capacity computer facility there, sir, which has been an important part of the network since the transition. Why do they have trouble getting people to work there? It's in the Rocky Mountains, sir, far away from any large towns. There's not much else to do there, sir, except work on the computer. They sometimes have trouble persuading people to work there. Sounds promising, Jeeves. Could you put me in touch with an employment office there? Yes, sir. One moment, sir. I'll see if anyone is available. Neil waited. He was a little impatient to get started now that he had some idea of how to proceed. Maybe his analysis of the situation was leading him astray, but he had no idea how to fight back if this wasn't the way to go. Brianna would be disappointed that he wouldn't be visiting her and the children so often, but there was the phone. He could see them by phone. If long distance were a luxury, he'd be happy to pay for it. Sir, are you ready to talk to Julian Martinez about working in the Los Alamos area? Yes, Jeeves. Please put him on. How do you do, Mr. Martinez? I'm Neil Campbell. Jeeves, please make my employment record available to Mr. Martinez at his convenience. How do you do, Mr. Campbell? I understand that you'd like some assistance in finding work in this area. Yes, Mr. Martinez. I've been waiting to get into the computer business. Back before I went abroad to work for Uncle Sam, I really enjoyed my computer studies. I understand that computers have no doubt changed far too much in the last 20 years for me to become a programmer or a software engineer, but I thought there might be something computer-related that I could do, sort of on the fringes of the computing business, that would allow me to learn what I could do in that line. I believe I understand what you want. We do have several computing facilities here in Los Alamos. We also have a labor shortage. I believe we can probably find a variety of things you would find congenial and productive. Please allow me to look over your references and talk to some people here. I should be able to present you with several alternatives tomorrow afternoon. Shall I notify your man? At this, Julian smiled slightly. When I have something for you? That would be most considerate of you, sir. I shall await your call. Thank you, and good day to you, sir. It will be my pleasure to be of service to you, sir, until tomorrow. Thank you, Jeeves. You may close the connection. Very good, sir. Will there be anything else, sir? Tomorrow. That's a Monday. I just did business with an employment office on a Sunday. Well, that proves that employment offices aren't run by the government, Neil chuckled to himself. Jeeves, please call Brianna. Social call. Neil explained that he had felt the need to get away from everything and examine what he wanted to do with his life. He said that the mountains of New Mexico would let him have the isolation and the change of scenery necessary to discover himself. He said that he didn't know how long it would take, but that he didn't think he would be gone very long, perhaps only a couple of months. Brianna was disappointed, but philosophical about it. Neil next notified Jerome that he would probably not be driving with him more than another day or two. He told Sam that the house would be available again by the end of the week. He walked downtown with a couple of sacks of groceries to return them to the store and post a notice for the farmers that he wouldn't be coming by to pick up organic waste, and gave Jerome as a contact person. He also spent a couple of hours on Tuesday morning sitting on Enid's porch chatting about life in general and what he had learned by working at the TDP plant. Then he experienced a feeling of loss as he realized that he would probably never be coming back to Aldi. He'd been treated well by the people of that small town, and he would miss them, even Desiree. Neil had chosen work as what we might call a computer operator. His actual post was to be a human being in the computer center in case something needed to be done physically to any of the equipment. As his computer knowledge was out of date, he couldn't have expected anything much more technical, but for Neil's objectives, nothing could have gotten him closer to the very computers he felt were the key to finding the group that was creeping closer to controlling every aspect of life. Neil had decided to drive to New Mexico and had allocated 3 days for the trip. He found that there was much less traffic than he expected. There were trucks on the road, but not as many as there had been 20 years before. There were some very nice cars on the interstate, but, again, not as many. He wondered if the lack of traffic was a symptom of economic decay or of repression. He decided to find out. Selecting a likely-looking truck stop, he pulled in and sought a place at the counter. After ordering and then waiting quietly for a couple of minutes, he was able to strike up a conversation with a trucker sitting 2 stools over. He was an older man, which is why Neil had selected the stool he did, and was happy to talk. Neil worked the conversation around to the traffic, which was not hard to do, and inquired whether it was just his imagination or was there less traffic than years ago when he'd left the country. "Oh, yeah. Traffic is down quite a bit from what it was years ago. I remember right after the transition when we had that gas shortage. There was almost nothing but trucks on the road in those days, and not so many of them. People were trying to only ship essentials. Lots of folks found ways to make things locally instead of importing from someplace across the country. After the shortage ended, there didn't seem any reason to stop making things locally if there was a local market for them. As for the cars, folks travel a lot more by train than they did before. It costs a lot less, and it's a lot more comfortable. Also, fewer people own cars. Why spend half your money to have and maintain a car when you can get around just fine without one most of the time and can rent one cheaply for the times you do need a car? Cars are really expensive when you don't have to have one for getting to work. I don't own one myself." Neil had noticed that his was one of the very few plain cars on the road. Most of the cars he saw on the highway were obviously luxury cars. His own car was a hybrid, gas and electric. It got over 60 miles per gallon and would go pretty fast, but Neil was in no great hurry. At least there was no ominous reason for the light traffic, and it did make highway travel less stressful. Neil also noticed that there were no billboards. There were discrete signs on the highway indicating products available at the next exit, but no billboards or large garish signs. The motels he stopped at were luxury places. The prices were not as high as he remembered, but he was able to get rooms with no reservations and was able to order standard food in the restaurant at the motel. He was not surprised to find that Jeeves was available with each TV. It was comforting to talk with Brianna each night and ask the kids what they had learned in school each day. He got to Santa Fe the afternoon of the third day and decided to spend the night there and report to Julian the next morning. He walked around the downtown and enjoyed looking at the authentic Indian and Spanish architecture and crafts. He was tempted to buy some jewelry for Brianna, but decided he would have plenty of time for that later. The air was crisp and cooled quickly as dusk set in. He decided to buy a light jacket. The clerk was helpful in inquiring about his intended use for the jacket, and finally ended by recommending several hiking paths and other activities that would be available near Los Alamos. Neil had the impression that he had been served by the Chamber of Commerce or the local booster club, but as a result of the clerk's comments and suggestions, he had selected a different jacket than he would have and saved about 20% on the price. Neil left the store wearing the jacket and feeling pretty good. The people here appeared to be just as friendly as the folks back in Aldi. He still had over $70,000 in his account. The new work might lead him to the conspiracy he knew must be there. He went back to the hotel with more optimism than at any time since he had landed at Dulles Airport. The next day, Neil met Julian Martinez at his office in an actual office building in Los Alamos. Neil had begun to think that all officers were in homes. There were empty offices in the building, evidence of the disappearance of government-sponsored projects. After the usual greetings, Julian said that they had an appointment at a computer server farm and data repository for later that morning. While they waited, Julian showed Neil around the town, including several housing offices in Julian's building. On Julian's recommendation, Neil made an appointment at one of them. At the appointed hour, they went to the computation center where they met some of the people with whom Neil would be working. They were a diverse lot. Some were left over from the days when Los Alamos had been a major center for nuclear weapons research. Others were what Neil would have called hippies in his youth. There were some whose appearance was that of the American Indian, several Hispanics, and a smattering of Asians. He was interviewed informally for about 2 hours as people came by when they got a break from what they were doing to ask him questions and tell him about what it was like to work there. Neil's responsibility was mostly physical security at night. He was to be a night watchman, but he was expected to be able to replace and do minor repairs for much of the equipment on the machine room floor. His own questions had more to do with what services they were providing. His guess that they were somehow involved with the accounting computers was correct. Over the next few days, Neil learned that this computer center had been one of the first places to be utilized for testing the programs that made the accounting computer what it was. He even heard an amusing story from the first year after the transition. It seems that a bright young hacker and one of the security guards had the brilliant idea of increasing the amount of money in their accounts without going through the formality of actually doing anything to deserve being paid, nor involving a payer. One of the operators on duty after hours was the guard's girlfriend, so the guard distracted the operator by making love to her while the hacker slipped in and, using the console and his knowledge of the operating system, was able to gain access to the accounts database and change the values in his and the guard's accounts. Then he slipped out of the building undetected. They were riding high until the first time one of them tried to spend money. Then he found out that his account was frozen by court order, and he was to appear in the local court the next Tuesday for trial. Since the two of them had no money, they couldn't run except on foot. They might have left the country, but then they wouldn't have been a problem anymore for the U.S. They did appear in court as requested and were presented with the evidence of what they had done. They pled guilty and were sentenced to have their story publicized and made into a comedy movie. They had their 15 minutes of fame at the price of looking foolish to everyone who saw the movie. Naturally, the event also became a part of their reputations. Lastly, the operator was so embarrassed that she broke up with the guard. What made this story so funny to the staff of the computer center was that by changing the amount of money in their accounts, the hacker and friend had identified themselves as the criminals. They hadn't known that the computer system was highly redundant, such that when they changed the values in the database in Los Alamos, they made that installation's data no longer match the data at the other installations. Therefore, the source of the insertion was sought, found, and examined. The entry of data from the console considerably narrowed the range of possible suspects, and the time of day had identified the operator on duty. Her testimony concerning how the console had been used and her evening activities had pretty much clinched the case. Neil also found that changing the program that ran the accounting system required simultaneous entry of the changes from each of the many consoles in the distributed system. The proposed new code was freely available for several months for others to test before being installed. It was common for computer science students to be assigned to find new ways to test new code. Also, the source code for the accounting was freely available. Therefore, it was common for hackers and others to attempt to find bugs and vulnerabilities. The rewards for finding problems and for providing solutions were rather high. The people with whom Neil would be working most closely weren't available in many cases since they worked other shifts. But he was taken under the wing of a crusty old operator named Fred Gunderson, who had been working there for some 35 years and dated back to the 20th century. He could remember when he had to have a security clearance to enter the building. He was also carrying a handgun and a holster on his belt. Needless to say, this caught Neil's attention. "Well, I need to carry a gun too?" Neil was perfectly willing to carry a gun, but he hadn't expected to have any call to shoot someone as part of this job. "It's this way. There are some pretty crazy groups living in the mountains who would like nothing better than to destroy the accounting system and go back to a palm. For them, this place is a symbol of all they hate. They've never actually attacked this place, but there have been some nasty rumors about plans to attack it. I figured that if they do attack, there should be somebody to put up at least a token resistance. If they kill me, then they'll have shown their true colors as terrorists, and the army can come in and root them out. Otherwise, if they just come in here and smash the place, it may not be replaced, and nobody will be able to work here anymore. Most folks don't want to work out here miles from nowhere, but for some of us, it's as close to heaven on earth as you can find. We like this place, and we don't want to lose it." "You carry a gun so you can get killed?" Neil was half joking and half serious. "It sounds kind of funny when you say it that way, but that's what it comes down to. I'm willing to put my life on the line to protect what's mine. I don't ask anyone else to do so, but I made my decision and I've never regretted it. I also haven't made a secret of my intentions. There are several others of us who feel the same way. They carry guns to work too." "Do you keep the gun loaded?" Neil asked. "Son, you have to treat every gun as if it's always loaded. I wouldn't carry this gun unless I was willing to use it, and an empty gun's not much good. If I'm going to be killed, I intend to be very dangerous to my killers." "Would it be all right if I carried a gun as well?" Fred laughed. "Given your work history, I'd be pleased and proud to have you join the over-the-hill gang. That's what we call those of us who carry guns." "Do you issue guns, or do I have to provide my own?" "We aren't police, and we aren't military. A gun's a luxury, so you'll have to provide your own. Now, that might take you a while, so I wouldn't count on getting one right away." Neil asked Jeeves where the nearest gun shop was and was told that it was in Santa Fe. Since acquiring the gun was not a high priority item, Neil figured that he'd wait until he was in Santa Fe for some other reason and pick one up then. But talking to Jeeves did bring up another topic that Neil had been wondering about. "Fred, you've been working around computers most of your adult life, haven't you?" "That I have. I even had a little computer to play with when I was in junior high." "Have you ever wondered, well," Neil said, brushing his hair back with his left hand, "whether they are alive in some way? You know, like Jeeves. He sounds, and I bet he could look just like a person on the monitor. It's spooky in a way." "Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. There was a movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey in which a computer was named Hal, and that computer seemed to be alive in a lot of ways. I remember looking at my computer and wondering if someday computers would be like Hal and take over things. I guess that's been one of the most common computer-related fears of people since way back before I was born. So, do you think they might actually have an awareness like people do? I guess there must be some computer research going on that's trying to create a computer program that generates self-awareness in them, but I don't think it'll happen anytime soon. Have you heard about them using natural selection to write computer software? Can't say whether I did or not. It doesn't ring any bells. Well, they got some way of writing software so it makes billions of copies of itself, each with some random little changes in them. Now, most of them just die or fail right away and don't work at all. The software gets rid of those. But a few work differently. Most of those don't do a good job at all or make errors, but some do the job better. Those copies the software keeps and uses to repeat the whole process. After a time, the programs get better and better. Maybe something like that might one day make a living computer, but I wouldn't hold my breath. But don't you ever worry about the computer taking over and running things? Never. The computer doesn't give a damn. It doesn't care about anything. It's like a rock or a fire. It doesn't have any choice about what it does, any more than those pliers over there choose what to pinch. If a computer ever tried to take over, it would be because some person was using it, not because the computer wanted world domination. How can you be so sure of that? Because they still can't make computers that take care of themselves. Sure, they use computers to manufacture almost everything. But the computers break down in ways a person or an animal never would, just from not trying to take care of themselves. They haven't got any sense. Well, I sure hope you're right. The work was not that difficult, since it mostly required only that he be present, but he made a point of studying some of the documentation for the systems he was protecting. He also asked a lot of questions about how the equipment typically failed and what kind of things to be sensitive to. The facility had its own uninterruptible power source, and he was also expected to try to repair the large diesel engine in an emergency. He hoped that would never come, since he had never been particularly good with engines. He was paying close attention when they tested it one night and was impressed that it also ran quietly just as Bart had done. This engine also had its own computer, though it was not intelligent enough to have personality. Then he was told that it was the computer he was to repair or replace, not the engine itself. There were spare computers which could be used with the engine if the built-in computer failed. Neil formed several friendships with other operators and some of the other staff. His frequent questions labeled him as someone who wanted to better himself in the organization, so everyone was happy to answer his questions. Neil was invited to join several of his friends and some others going to a party one Friday night. This party was a turning point in Neil's life, which, as turning points often do, looked very much like a disaster at the time. Invisible Hand, Chapter 27, A Night on the Town, in which Neil meets a bartender and some fellow jailbirds. Everything began happily, with the friends meeting in Santa Fe at a nice restaurant. Since Neil was a new guy, they had selected a Spanish cuisine establishment so he could find out about the real food of Mexico. There was much laughter, and though Neil was not usually a drinker, he did have 2 glasses of wine with the meal. One of the jokes was to have Neil sample some rather hot dishes without telling him how hot they were. But Neil had been living in a culture in which very spicy foods were standard. The party was quite impressed when Neil not only ate the hot food without appearing to notice the flavor, but even asked for seconds of one jalapeno-flavored dish. After that, he could do no wrong. When they had finished the meal, it was suggested that they go to another establishment that several of them knew, which served a very good home-brewed beer. That was such fun that still another establishment was suggested, and after a time Neil not only forgot how many places they had been to, but that he really had no head for liquor. By then the party was down to just 3, each of whom was still steady on their feet, but feeling no pain. After they each had a beer, one suggested that they show Neil how to drink tequila. They adjourned to the bar, where they asked for 3 tequilas. The bartender gave them a long look and finally acceded to their request. It was Neil's turn to pay, so he told the computer he was paying for the 3 tequilas. They were placed on the bar. The others each demonstrated the appropriate technique for aficionados of the drink. Neil was not quite as steady as usual and did not demonstrate the requisite flair to prevent the others from laughing at his attempt. He immediately took umbrage and demanded another tequila for another try. By this time the bartender thought he had already consumed more than enough. He refused Neil's order. Neil, already smarting under the laughter of his friends, took offense and began shouting at the bartender that he had every right to another drink and to get it on the bar quickly or he would have the bartender fired. After a couple of further exchanges, Neil leaned over the bar and took a swing at the bartender. The blow was a flush hit and knocked the man into the glassware behind him. The result was broken glass, a loud crash which effectively silenced the rest of the bar, and the bartender bleeding from the mouth, nose, and several cuts from the broken glass. Neil's friends were horrified and grabbed his arms to restrain him. Neil was rather surprised at the effectiveness of his blow and stood unresisting. He gave a bemused smile and said, "That will teach him to refuse my business." The police were called by the computer and arrived within 5 minutes. Neil was taken into custody, and his friends were advised to take a cab home. Within 10 minutes, Neil was getting to know the inside of the Santa Fe Municipal Jail. His first intelligent move in the last several hours was to lie down on the bed and go to sleep. He awoke to conversation from his cellmates, a serious hangover, and the realization that he was in trouble. He groaned and tried to sit up. This brought him to the attention of his new companions. One was an old man who had skin like leather, bleary eyes, and was missing several teeth. He had a neat haircut and clean clothes except for the spills of what looked like wine down the front of the shirt. The other was a much younger man, whom Neil would have said was about 30. He had dirty blonde hair, needed a shave, and was wearing all whites. He could have been a payer, except that Neil figured that payers were not likely to be in jail. He looked healthy enough. In fact, he was quite heavily muscled, but had a narrow waist. His teeth looked nearly perfect and a lightly tanned, even face. One could even say that he was handsome, but he had probably looked better 10 years before because there were telltale signs of dissipation around the bloodshot eyes. "Good morning," the younger man said. "Glad to have you with us. I'm Jean Baudin, and this old-timer is called Whiskey Pete. I don't know where he got that name, since he obviously prefers wine." Jean extended a hand to Neil, which Neil shook and used to sit up. He wasn't sure that that was wise, as it made his temples pound worse than ever, but he found that if he closed his eyes and held very still, after a little while the discomfort eased, and he thought he might not have to vomit. "I'm Neil Campbell," he croaked. "Is there anything for me to drink around here?" "If you're looking for the hair of the dog, I'm afraid you're out of luck. Pete here would have drunk it by now anyway. There are some paper cups here. I can get you some water." "Thanks, you're a lifesaver." Neil drank 2 cups and felt slightly better. "I'll bet you're in for drunk and disorderly," Jean grinned at Neil. Then the activities of the night before flooded back to Neil's memory, and he groaned again. "I'm afraid it was more than that. I think there's some assault and battery in there, too." Neil felt even worse thinking about it, and 10 seconds ago he would have sworn that was impossible. "Pete here is a resident because they don't like to have him cluttering up the street for fear he'll get killed. They also would like to find who gave him the wine, but old Pete will never give them a straight story." "May I ask your reasons for being here?" Neil thought it only fair they each be revealed. "I'm here on a bum rap. They arrested me for nothing. I had every right to be there. That owner must have bribed them or have something on them." "Sorry, Jean, you lost me there. I'm not thinking too well just yet. Where were you?" "I was in my house. I was just going to bed when they burst in and grabbed me." "I take it you were referring to the police?" Neil was trying to form a mental picture of the event. "Yes, they had this guy there who said he was the owner. Well, maybe he was, but I got a right to a place to live, and nobody else was using it, so he has no right to have me arrested." Jean was quite indignant. "Had the owner said you could stay there?" "First time I ever laid eyes on him was when he came in behind the police," Jean explained. "Then who told you it was all right for you to stay in that house?" Neil persisted, thinking he had missed something. "I could see there was nobody living there. It was dark inside, and there were no cars around. When I went in and looked over the place, it was obvious that nobody lived there. There was no trash in the trash cans. There was no food in the refrigerator or the cabinets. The closets had no clothes in them. I tell you, nobody was living there. So I figured I got squatters' rights. I got there first. Let other people get their own place." "You mean you didn't go by the housing office first?" Neil was beginning to wonder about this guy. "They just give you the runaround, and half the time they won't even help you. I mean, I tell them I want a place to stay, and they start asking impertinent questions. What business is it of theirs where I stayed before? Who cares whether I work or not? They got to give me a place to live, don't they? I mean, it's right there in the 10 rules. It says, necessities are free to all as needed, and I needed a place, so they got to give me one." 10 rules? Neil was a little confused, but it took his mind off his misery a little. "Yeah, you know, those 10 rules that tell everybody how their money is supposed to work. Well, one of them says they got to give you what you need, like food and clothes and a house to live in. They got no excuse to arrest me." Neil did have some vague recollection about 10 rules having to do with the new money, but he hadn't paid attention to it then, and it just had never come up since he had gotten back to the U.S. "But if you were in somebody else's house without their permission, weren't you trespassing?" "I told you, there was nobody living there. How can I be trespassing when there's nobody living there? Now, if I'd just come in on some family or something, they might have a case. But there was nobody living there. It was an empty house. I have every right to it. A sudden realization dawned on Jean. Damn! I bet somebody else is going to move into that house, and I was there first. You don't suppose that guy wasn't the real owner, but just some guy who wanted the place for himself, do you? If that's what happened, I'm going to kick up quite a fuss. It's bad enough that they arrested me for no reason, but if that guy thinks he's going to get away with grabbing my house too, I'll show him. Well, don't punch him in the face, whatever you do. I don't think they like that around here. Neil was thinking of his own troubles. Later that morning, the cellmates were taken upstairs to the courtroom. The judge sat at her bench near an empty jury box. There were no spectators so far as Neil could see, except a couple of idlers in whites near the back of the room. Whiskey Pete was first. The arresting officer told the judge that Pete had been found on his back in an alley behind a restaurant. Upon investigation, it was found that he was stinking drunk and unable to walk. The officer had taken Pete to the clinic, where he was checked and found to be only drunk. Later, the officer had returned and talked to Pete to attempt to ascertain who had given him the alcohol. No bottles had been found near Pete that could not be attributed to those thrown away by the restaurant. The officer had already been to the restaurant to remind the workers there to completely empty all bottles that contained alcohol before throwing them away. They claimed to have done so last night. Pete would not or could not account for the source of the alcohol he had drunk. The judge commended the officer for his conduct on the case, then turned to Pete. Pete, why will you not go home when you have a bottle? You know that you could die of exposure out on the streets. You could also be hit by a car. Now, I am going to excuse the officer here for disturbing your rest in the alley, since it was clear that you were not able to take care of yourself. If you press charges against him, I will rule against you. Do you need help to get home? No, Your Honor. I can walk just fine now. Thank you. Pete responded and turned away to go. Neil was astonished. It seemed that the policeman was the one on trial. Pete had been in jail, and the arresting officer was the one who had to justify his actions in dragging a drunk off the streets. What kind of crazy court system did they have out here? Jean was the next brought before the judge. The arresting officer again stated what he had done. Your Honor, I was on second shift and making my rounds when I got a call about a trespasser at 432 Winstead. The complainant asserted that he owned the house at that address and that someone was in the house without permission. I confirmed the identity of the complainant and that he did indeed own the property at 432 Winstead. The complainant accompanied me to the property. We entered the residence and found Mr. Jean Baudin apparently preparing for bed. He expressed outrage and told us to leave the property immediately. He asserted that the house was his. I activated the computer in the living room and pointed out to him that it confirmed the complainant as the owner of the residence. Mr. Baudin continued to assert that the house was his and refused to vacate the premises. The owner asked me to remove Mr. Baudin, and since Mr. Baudin was adamant about remaining, I therefore exercised force to remove Mr. Baudin from the premises. Upon reaching the street, I released Mr. Baudin. The owner had brought Mr. Baudin's suitcase and clothing to the street. Mr. Baudin then packed his clothing and some toiletries in his suitcase and headed for the house again. It was apparent to me that unless physically restrained, Mr. Baudin intended to continue to trespass. Therefore, I brought him to jail to await the opening of the court this morning. The judge turned to Jean and inquired if the officer had correctly described the events of the preceding evening. Pretty much, Your Honor, Jean replied. But I want to assure you that there was nobody living in the house when I got there. It was empty, and there was no food or clothes or even trash in the trash bins. Nobody was living there, and I have every right to move in. I was not bothering anybody. He had no right to have me evicted. I don't have any money, and I needed a house. This house was empty, so I took it. Mr. Baudin, the house was owned, and still is owned by Mr. Kittrell. That house is his property. He may leave the house empty if he so chooses. You have no right to use Mr. Kittrell's property without his consent. In fact, you attempted to use Mr. Kittrell's property over his objections expressed directly to you upon the premises in the presence of a witness. Despite being lawfully removed from the premises, you attempted to return to those premises over the expressed objections of Mr. Kittrell. Therefore, it is clear that the officer acted within his duty in arresting you and bringing you to jail. You had given every indication of intent to repeat your offense if given the opportunity. You mean was I going back into my house? Jean burst in. You're darn right I was. I got a right to have a place to live. It's right there in the 10 rules. It says necessities are free to all as needed, and I sure needed a place to spend the night. Besides, I was there first. There was nobody there when I got there. The judge finally rapped her gavel to end Jean's advocacy. Mr. Baudin, you will be silent for a moment and listen to me. The 10 rules describe the money we use and what it is able to buy. That rule, necessities are free to all as needed, means that money is not able to buy necessities. It means that if no one gives you a necessity, you have no right to take that necessity. If someone does give you a necessity for whatever reason, and that necessity provides you some benefit, then the person who gave it to you will be paid by a payer if their actions result in a net benefit for that pay period. There is no requirement on any individual to provide you with any particular item or service. If someone gives you bread or a shirt or allows you to use a building of theirs, it is because they willingly did so. There is no requirement that anyone give you anything unless their actions have prevented you from being able to gain access to necessities. For example, your arresting officer placed you in jail. This was done by the use of force, for you did not go willingly to jail. Having placed you in jail, he was then required to provide you with necessities for your health and well-being while you were so confined. I believe that you were provided with breakfast this morning? Yes, Your Honor, Jean admitted. Then the officer did his duty toward you. So far as I can see, the officer did his duty in every respect. He released you once you were no longer on Mr. Kittrell's property the first time, and it was only when you insisted on returning to that property that he resorted to bringing you to jail. He brought you to this court at the first opportunity so that your case could be adjudicated. The owner and the arresting officer were both acting well within their rights and duties. But, Your Honor, there was nobody in the house. He wasn't doing anybody any good, and I needed a place to live. It isn't fair that he should have an extra house when I need a house and have none. Jean was obviously quite convinced. Mr. Baudin, the judge said, it is clear to me that you either do not understand or do not wish to admit your guilt in this matter. Therefore, I must ask you whether you will accept my judgment or prefer another court. I don't understand, Your Honor, Jean replied, apparently uncertain for the first time that day. The officer brought you to this court because he was the one who had to defend his actions in using force to arrest you. Unless he could show that you were going to continue to use force or were not able to care for yourself, then you would be released immediately. In your case, your persistence in returning to the property of Mr. Kittrell indicated that the officer had to use force to prevent your using force toward Mr. Kittrell and using his property without consent. But you are guilty, it would appear, of a crime against Mr. Kittrell. Therefore, as the defendant, you have the opportunity to choose a court in which your case will be tried. That is, we will attempt to find a court that both you and Mr. Kittrell agree upon as appropriate and hold the case there. Mr. Kittrell has indicated his willingness to have my court try the case. Now, I am asking you if you also are willing to have my court try the case. If you agree, we can proceed. If you do not agree, then you may select from the available courts in this jurisdiction. Do you agree to have your case tried in this court? The judge repeated the question. I guess so. Jean was uncertain still. Do you wish to have an attorney represent you in this matter? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Jean now was certain. You may leave the courtroom to obtain the services of an attorney. Please return within 1 hour. There's a terminal just outside the door that you can use. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Baudin to the terminal and see that he is able to use it to get an attorney. Neil's case was the last of the three. He accompanied the arresting officer to the bench to stand before the judge. Your Honor, I was working the second shift on patrol when I got a call from Mao's bar on 7th Street about a disturbance. When I arrived, I found the accused being restrained by 2 other men. The bartender was behind the bar, where there was a considerable amount of broken glassware and bottles on the counter behind him. The bartender was also still bleeding from the nose and lip and had some cuts on his back and head from the broken glass. The patrons of the bar asserted that the accused, one Neil David Campbell of Los Alamos, had struck the bartender in the face with his fist one blow, which had caused all the visible damage to the property of the bar and to the bartender's person. Mr. Campbell was unsteady in his walking and slurred in his speech. The 2 men holding him had also obviously been drinking, but said that they had each had several drinks at several bars. They asserted that Mr. Campbell had been angered when the bartender had refused to sell him further drinks and had punched the bartender once on the face. Mr. Campbell said, "That will teach him to refuse me a drink," and did not deny having struck the blow. When asked if the bartender had made any move to strike Mr. Campbell, all witnesses agreed that far from having struck Mr. Campbell or having tried to strike Mr. Campbell, the bartender appeared completely surprised when Mr. Campbell struck him. Being thus unprepared for the blow, he had lost his balance and fallen backward into the glassware. Inasmuch as there was considerable evidence that Mr. Campbell had inflicted intentional bodily injury upon the bartender and given Mr. Campbell's continuing belligerent attitude, I brought Mr. Campbell to jail pending the opening of court this morning. The judge turned to Neil. Do you wish to correct or amend in any way the testimony of the arresting officer? No, ma'am. So far as I can remember, the officer was completely correct in bringing me to jail and used no undue force, Neil said. The judge turned back to the officer and asked, Does the bartender wish to prefer charges against Mr. Campbell? No, Your Honor, I don't believe so. I think Ricardo is more embarrassed than anything. You will go contact Ricardo and make quite sure, officially, that he is not pressing charges. I want all the specifics recorded so there is no doubt. Yes, Your Honor. I would have gotten them last night, but Ricardo needed to get his cut seen to at the clinic. The officer hurried out of the room. Now then, Mr. Campbell, you understand that you are in a very serious situation here, whether Ricardo presses charges or not. You have admitted to striking someone who is not threatening you. You did enough damage to him by that attack that he needed medical attention. You also caused some damages to the property in the bar. Let us dispose of the little matters first. Are you prepared to buy all the property that was destroyed in the bar? Neil did a rough calculation and said, I believe that I have enough money, and I am quite willing to buy everything that I broke in the bar, especially if someone will dispose of it properly for me. The judge smiled. In that case, let's get that done while the officer checks with Ricardo about those charges. Bailiff, a terminal, please. The bailiff brought out a TV and set it on the judge's bench. Contact Mal's Bar and ask to speak to the owner of the broken glassware and bottles. In a few moments, the voice of someone on the terminal responded. Yes, Your Honor? I understand that there were significant damages to your property behind the bar last night due to the actions of one Neil Campbell in assaulting your bartender. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, it is. Do you have a total cost of the damages to the luxury items destroyed? Yes, Your Honor. We were expecting your call. We've calculated that the damages come to $638.44 and have so informed the accounts computer, complete with scans of the damage. Mr. Campbell, do you agree to buy the items you damaged in the amount of $638.44? Neil intoned, Your Honor, I wish to buy the items so described at the price of $638.44. Please debit my account accordingly. After the usual confirmations from the computer and the bars agreeing to dispose of the broken materials, the judge resumed. Why did you strike the bartender? Your Honor, I believe it was a combination of things. First, and most important, I had drunk too much. Had I not been drunk, I don't believe I would have struck him for so minor a matter. Second, I was embarrassed because my friends were laughing at me over something silly. Finally, he was refusing to sell me any more drinks. Naturally, I took this as criticism of my behavior in having drunk so much. I struck out at him simply because of my mental state. Though this may explain my action, I do not think it in any way excuses my action. I see. I hope you understand, Mr. Campbell, that we cannot tolerate one person physically attacking another person except to defend himself or his property. I do understand that, Your Honor. I would not have it any other way. I'm glad to hear that, because if you accept this court, you may find my judgment harsh. Are you willing to accept this court? Yes, ma'am, I am prepared to accept this court's judgment without reservation. Do you wish to have the representation of an attorney? Your Honor, I am guilty of unprovoked assault. I have observed your judgments and feel yours will be just in my case. Unless you advise me otherwise, I will forego an attorney in this case. Very well. Mr. Campbell, yours is a particularly serious case for several reasons. First and most obviously, you have inflicted bodily harm on a fellow citizen working to serve you, and you did so without provocation. That alone warrants a strong response from this bench. Secondly, you have revealed a weakness with respect to alcohol that makes the offense even worse. Alcohol is readily available in this community. There is no reasonable way that you can be prevented from acquiring alcohol, as a case earlier this morning made abundantly clear. Your weakness, therefore, can be expected to result in further such attacks on your fellow citizens. Finally, the sheer irrationality of the action, its lack of warning signs for the bartender, indicates that there is some other factor that is putting you under considerable stress at what may be a subconscious level. Therefore, Mr. Campbell, these are the alternatives I will present to you. Your first alternative is banishment. You will take yourself from this community and never return. Your reputation will include your actions and a warning from this bench about your unpredictable violence. Few would want to risk working with you. If you return, you will be considered a dangerous outlaw, and any citizen may reasonably expect to be attacked by you at any moment. Therefore, your mere physical presence will be considered as a threat to attack. Your second alternative is to wear a collar that will introduce into your bloodstream a chemical tranquilizer whenever your emotional state becomes excited. This will prevent your having any strong emotion, whether good or bad. It is only half a life, but it will protect others from your irrational attacks." By this time, Neil was in a cold sweat. His decision to trust this judge appeared to have been completely wrong. His expectations concerning the sentence had been perhaps a 30-day jail term at the worst, but she was talking about lifetime sentences, and all for one stupid, heedless punch. "Your third alternative is as follows. You will give up drinking altogether for the rest of your life. Now, I realize and understand that there is no way we can monitor your behavior in this regard. If you choose to go back on your word in this matter, you will be able to drink, and we may not find out. But we will add a prohibition on buying alcoholic beverages to your account. This should alert any who would otherwise sell you alcohol. You will also attend payer school for a full term of instruction beginning as soon as a replacement can be found for you at your workplace, or 1 week, whichever is sooner. At payer school, you will be under observation, and you will have opportunities to drink and to lose your temper. Should you do either, you will default to the first alternative above of banishment. In the event you successfully complete the course of instruction at payer school, and I get good reports on your behavior there, I will remove all restrictions from your account, and your record will be cleared in all public records. Of course, should you later appear in court, the judge will have your complete record available. Your Honor, the third alternative, payer school, seems to me the most attractive, but I don't know what payer school is." Payer school is a school that persons who wish to become payers are advised to attend before actually becoming payers. Attending this school is not required for prospective payers because any mentally competent adult is acceptable as a payer. You will not be required to become a payer even if you complete payer school successfully. You should also understand that any work you do while in payer school will not be paid. Therefore, in effect, by taking this option, you lose the opportunity to earn money while in school. Naturally, work you did before entering the school will continue to be considered for payment, and your account may grow while you are there. While in payer school, you will not be allowed to have luxuries nor to spend money. You may not give luxuries to others who are also attending payer school. They may have some other restrictions, but I believe those are the main ones. Your Honor, I believe those restrictions are quite acceptable to me. I would like to accept your third alternative as my sentence," Neil said, and bowed his head to the judge. Things moved quickly then. The arresting officer returned to the court with a deposition from Ricardo saying that he would not press charges. Neil used the terminal outside the court to notify Fred that he needed a replacement at work. Fred said that they would get along without him while he was away and to watch his step at payer school and come back clean. The officer at his elbow said that he would not need to get his things from Los Alamos. At his request, they could be put in storage for him there. Neil asked the officer in Los Alamos to get his things from his apartment and put them in storage for him. The officer agreed to do so. Within the hour, Neil was at the bus station, headed for payer school.
Thank you for attending today's presentation of Invisible Hand by Larry K. Mason, brought to you by GayTalkRadio.org and QueerPublicRadio.com. We hope you will join us tomorrow as the story continues at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and 6 p.m. Pacific Time. In case you've missed any of the episodes, you may listen to them by visiting QueerPublicRadio.com or by visiting Mr. Mason's website at www.nopom.info. That's www.nopom.info. Thank you for joining us, and as always, we wish the best to you and yours.